But before we jump to some of the other things, you mentioned right at the end there, like asking questions for coaching. I think that's an incredibly important skill that, I mean, at least as far as I'm aware, no expert at all, but in sport coaching and sport coaching theory, we're kind of seeing more and more that this is often, even if you know the answer, if you can make the other person say it to you, it's going to be beneficial for loads and loads of reasons. But it's
Yep.
really, really uncommon in esports. So what tips would you have for people to try and get used to coaching by asking questions?
I think there are coaches I worked with that are like very smart about the game, and they will obviously they index on that, or they're going to give, oh well, in this situation you should have done this. It's like, okay. Some players say that they prefer coaches saying like, oh, okay, just give me the answer, and the players will take the answer. It's like, I just be direct. I don't need to be led down the garden path. I just want to know what's right and what's wrong, or what I should have done. Some players say that, and I think that builds into the kind of the instant gratification kind of culture, that the kind of limited attention span that we have. And I think that even if you have the answer, if you don't know why you should have done it and when you should do it in the future. So I'll give you an example that I use quite a lot, and maybe it explains it a bit better. But let's say we're watching scrims, John, and let's say we're in review with the players, you and me, and if you tell them, okay, in this situation here, you guys should have just rotated the top, and everyone's like nodding, right? They're all like, oh, that makes sense. You are now hoping that, number one, this situation will happen again exactly. Number two, every one of the 5 players will remember what to do. And number 3, we spoke about it in theory only. So we're hoping that they can actually execute on it practical wise, but they've never done it before. You're hoping for all of these things to happen at the same time, because in a review, you're like, oh, just should have gone top. And it makes sense to everyone. They all go, oh, yeah, that actually is the smartest thing to do. It's not the smartest thing to do that is the best thing to do, because sometimes you'll spend 20 minutes talking about something and you'll go through different iterations and you'll end up with the smartest thing. Like, this is, oh my God, this is so smart. You did that in 20 minutes together. You have 10 seconds to figure it out in game and do it. I don't think the smartest decision is the best one. It just depends on how quickly people can recognize it. But I feel like players themselves, it's better to teach them to kind of to fish, because they can learn like, oh, well, if this happens again in this situation, if I can recognize the triggers, I'll be able to come to an answer faster. So that's one of the best things as a coach, is try to figure out like, how much does your player know about certain things. And then reviews for me are, it's like a pop quiz and scrims where you try and figure out, your enemy puts you in very weird situations, and as a coach you try and figure out like, oh wow, these are our big weaknesses and these are things we're good at, and you try to cover up the weaknesses and build up on the strengths and stuff, whatever way you want to go about it. But it's hard to get good at everything. So if you ask questions, you'll figure out if players actually have a deep understanding or not. It's not about having a shallow understanding, it's about deep. And if they don't, then you can work one-on-one with them. But if you tell them the answer, you don't know that they're actually going to remember next time. There's maybe, the telephone number, for example, is like the kind of like the upper limit of like what people can remember in the short-term memory. But when we go through a scrim, we might have, I've seen reviews where coaches have 6 or 7 points in a review, and then you multiply that by 5 or 6 games in a day. You're not remembering 46 things in the day. And number 2, each player is leaving the review with a different kind of importance or like priority. So you're never going to get players on the same page regarding like what you're going to remember from it. The best coach I worked with, sometimes he would come in and just go, all right, this is the most important thing in the game. We lost the game here. You have to remember this 1 point. You have no choice but to remember 1 point. And number 2, he would see 2 players arguing and he would watch them and listen. They would argue like back and forth, blah, blah, blah. And then he would come in the end and go, oh, okay, well, you should have done this. And it would have been completely right, like 9 times out of 10. But he would allow them the discourse, the ability to exchange ideas. But he would, it would sometimes get heated between the players, but he'd be okay with that. And then he would give them the answer, rather than he didn't have to be a coach who was like, oh, I know the answer, and tell them straight away. Right. So I think like it's important to as a coach to not just be the guy in front of the room, but how do you like? I've had to do reviews before in the past. Like, how do you actually lead a review whereby your only job is kind of like the conductor of an orchestra. You're trying to get players to talk with each other. Some coaches are like that, and I think they work really well with players that need that kind of direction. And there are some, I won't name them, but there are very smart coaches like that do that really well in the LEC, for example, and go worlds and win splits. You can narrow it down from there, but like they're very, very good at kind of being that guy who kind of like facilitates discussion. And then there are coaches who have to be the guy who is not just the guy conducting, but the lead guitarist and the lead singer. So it just depends on what your team needs.
I think as well, when you're talking, a lot of the things that are actually underpinning the kind of behaviors that you're saying is actually, ironically, more confidence and potentially even more understanding of the game. Because if you're not just understanding what the team should do, but you're trying to understand what's actually the triggers that are underpinning that, so that you can then explore that and see if they actually understand how you would get to the conclusion of going top in that same example,